Today, we are plunging deep into the core problem facing every regulator, every policymaker, and frankly, anyone building on the technological frontier. Our source material puts the uncomfortable truth right at the top. We are attempting to regulate a living system.
And that's such a powerful phrase, isn't it?
Yeah.
Living system.
It really is.
Because the entire technological terrain, it just shifts so dramatically. Often every 6 months.
So you think you've got a handle on it, and then poof, a new model, a new breakthrough, and the boundaries are completely redrawn.
Exactly. And that acceleration creates what our sources call the pacing paradox.
Okay.
The paradox is that regulation, it inherently assumes stability. It needs a fixed target.
But AI doesn't offer that.
Not at all. It offers exponential change. And the inevitable result of this mismatch is that rules are, they're functionally obsolete before they're even written into law.
Let alone implemented.
Forget about it. So the problem isn't just about speed. It's that our whole framework, our institutions, they're still designed for a world that moves in these nice, predictable, incremental steps.
A world that doesn't exist anymore.
Right. So our mission in this deep dive is to explore the necessary shift, both philosophically and practically, from these static safety frameworks to what our sources call anticipatory governance.
Anticipatory governance. That sounds like a blend of futurism and policy. What does that actually encompass?
It's a discipline that it strategically blends systems thinking, strategic foresight, and agile regulatory design.
Okay.
Traditionally, governance follows a very simple linear path. First, you define a known harm.
Right.
Second, you quantify the risk of that harm. And third, you write a very specific rule to stop it.
Slow, deliberate, methodical.
Precisely. But AI just fundamentally breaks that model. The harms evolve as the models evolve. The risks, they multiply through these hidden, complex connections we can't even map in advance.
And the rules become obsolete.
Instantly. Because the goalposts are just sprinting down the field. It's an unsustainable cycle.
Okay, so let's unpack this shift. Moving from static safety to something that has to be inherently dynamic. Because trying to regulate an exponential technology with static rules sounds, frankly, impossible. Our sources use a powerful analogy here. They say it's like mapping a coastline during a rising tide.
That analogy just perfectly captures the futility of it.
The photo is outdated the moment the shutter closes.
Exactly. You can't take a snapshot of safety today and just assume it applies tomorrow. So the core takeaway is we need a new goal.
A different goal altogether.
Yes. We need to stop measuring static safety, the absence of a known failure, and start measuring systemic resilience.
Resilience. Okay, can you define that for us? Because it's a term that gets thrown around a lot. What does it mean specifically here for a living system like AI?
Right. So resilience, in this context, it's not the impossible goal of having zero disruption. It is the capacity of the entire system to absorb shocks, to adapt its processes, and to keep functioning without, collapsing the underlying infrastructure or public trust.
So we're talking about building an immune system for the societal infrastructure that this technology touches.
That is the perfect way to put it. An immune system. And the distinction between static safety and systemic resilience is so crucial, especially when you look at the questions they force you to ask.
How so?
Well, static safety asks a very narrow question, one we're comfortable with, something like, will this specific chatbot lie? Or will it show bias?
The specific testable problem.
Yes. But systemic resilience asks a much broader, much more consequential question. It asks, if millions of these chatbots are deployed and a bunch of them start hallucinating at the same time, does our information ecosystem,
journalism, search, academia,
does it have the immune system and the sheer speed to debunk them quickly? Or does public trust just erode completely?
That shift from the single node to the whole system, that changes everything.
Yeah.
But it also gets to that dilemma our sources flagged. If the goalposts are always moving, how do we technically define and measure systemic risk?
And that is the pivotal challenge.
If you can't measure it, how can you govern it?
You can't, not in the old way. And that's why the first tool of anticipatory governance is systems thinking. We have to move our whole perspective away from just assigning probabilities to single-point failures.
So we stop asking, what's the probability that this one thing goes wrong?
We stop asking that. Instead, we have to ask, what happens if this entire system fails, and where do the shock waves travel?
Okay.
Systems thinking forces you to map the architecture of the system, especially those hidden dependencies.
So instead of just worrying about one chatbot hallucinating, We worry about what happens downstream from that.
Precisely. You stop trying to assign a number value to a hypothetical failure, and you start mapping the dependency pathways. For example, say a big law firm uses an LLM to summarize regulatory documents.
Okay, that's one node.
Right. But what happens if that LLM introduces a subtle, consistent error into all of those summaries?
Yeah.
That error doesn't stay local. It propagates. It cascades into financial decisions, compliance systems, the advice they give clients. Systems thinking lets us spot those fragile nodes so we can, as the sources say, strengthen the shoreline, even if we can't predict the exact wave that's coming.
Strengthen the shoreline. I like that. It admits the threat is coming, but shifts the focus from predicting it to just increasing our defenses generally. But strengthening the shoreline still requires some idea of where the water might go. And that brings us back to this pressure on policymakers to, predict the future.
Which is a fool's errand.
Right. Our sources are very clear on that.
Okay.
Predicting the future is useless here. So the solution isn't better prediction, it's better preparation.
That is the key philosophical distinction, and that leads us right to the second tool, strategic foresight.
Okay, so let's look at the actual mechanisms here, because this is where policy really starts to feel dynamic. Our sources lay out two essential tools, starting with horizon scanning.
Horizon scanning is just the practice of scanning widely for weak signals, those early indicators of emerging trends. It's about building a collective intelligence apparatus designed to spot things on the periphery.
And the sources remind us that most of the tech that suddenly disrupts the world,
Social media, LLMs,
they were visible in research or prototype form years earlier. We weren't designed to notice them, or our institutions weren't set up to act on those signals.
And that lack of attention is a governance failure in itself. But the real power of strategic foresight, I think, is in the second tool, scenario stress testing.
Right. So instead of putting all our regulatory eggs in one basket for one projected future,
You prepare for multiple plausible futures.
this sounds much more robust than the typical 5-year plan. What kind of scenarios are we talking about here?
Well, the sources offer some really compelling high-impact examples. You take your current policy and you stress test it against wildly different conditions. For instance, what happens if compute suddenly becomes extremely cheap?
Available to every rogue actor. That changes the risk landscape completely.
Dramatically. Or, conversely, what if compute becomes a restricted resource, controlled by just a handful of nations or companies?
That's a concentration of power risk.
Huge. Or maybe the most immediate one. What if AI agents start acting fully autonomously, making complex economic decisions with no direct human prompts? We have to make sure our rules can handle all of that.
And another one the sources mentioned is, what if AI gets regulated like pharmaceuticals? Years of trials before deployment.
It would stifle innovation, sure, but it also creates a predictable safety net. The point isn't about which future is right.
It's about how the policy performs across all of them.
What's so fascinating is the goal. It's not to be right. It's to make sure your policy architecture is robust across all plausible futures. And that is the definition of adaptive governance. As the sources say, you're not aiming for the ball, you are covering the zone.
You design the policy to be resilient no matter which way the technology breaks. Okay, that focus on robustness is crucial. So if we've built systems thinking into our approach, strengthening the shoreline, and we've used strategic foresight to cover the zone, the next logical question is, where do humans fit into this incredibly fast system?
And this is where we move from the systemic tools to the operational safeguards. Because there's this dangerous assumption out there.
That algorithms will just eventually handle everything better than us.
Exactly, that they'll handle all the edge cases better. And maybe that's true for purely logical, repetitive tasks, but AI fails spectacularly, and sometimes dangerously, when it faces true novelty, ambiguity, or especially emotionally charged decisions.
Things that require moral consideration.
Yes. So the human isn't just a legacy component we haven't phased out yet. It's an essential, non-automatable part of the safety system.
It's a feature, not a bug.
It is. Machines react based on learned patterns. Humans reflect, based on context, values, empathy, and that reflection. That's the critical piece that has to be non-negotiable.
So the human in the loop isn't for rubber stamping outputs.
No. The source material is adamant. It's for resolving moral ambiguity.
Can you give us a quick illustration of what that looks like in practice?
Sure. Imagine a complex AI system that decides who gets medical benefits, or maybe a loan. The data might show, based on pure statistics, that a certain group should be denied. That would maximize statistical reliability.
Right.
But the human reviewing that file, they see the context, maybe a temporary crisis or some variable the algorithm just couldn't quantify, like community support.
The story behind the data points.
The story. And to really be that circuit breaker, the human needs to be close enough to intervene. They need the authority to override the system, not just suggest a tweak. And crucially, they have to use values and ethics to make that call, not just more data.
That internal friction, then, is what anchors this system to our ethics. When the raw optimized data says, do this to maximize profit, but the human context says this will harm the vulnerable, only a human can feel that conflict.
That tension is literally the safety mechanism.
Wow.
And this brings us to a fascinating way to measure this. How do you measure the quality of this human safety buffer? The key metric they propose is cognitive distance.
Cognitive distance.
It's the spatial and temporal distance between human judgment and algorithmic action.
So we're measuring how far away the system is drifted from our capacity to understand it and step in.
Yes, and the source material states this very clearly. If the system moves faster than human empathy can intervene, the system is fundamentally unsafe.
Even if it's statistically reliable. Even if it's technically flawless.
Even then, we have to recognize that empathy isn't just a nice-to-have. In a fast-moving AI system, empathy is safety.
That shifts the whole focus, from code quality to sheer speed. And if empathy is the circuit breaker, we have to talk about the speed mismatch between the tech and our institutions. The sources identify the most dangerous risk we face, not as the AI itself, but as the gap. The widening gap between the speed of change and the speed of our adaptation. This is really the core of anticipatory governance.
Absolutely. The system is speeding up, but our ability to notice, to understand, and to legislate is lagging further and further behind.
And that leads to a crucial calculation for this new era.
Yes, adaptation velocity.
Okay, how do we measure that?
You measure it as the total time it takes from when a weak signal first appears, like a new research paper, to informed recognition by regulators, all the way to a finalized implemented policy response.
So if it takes governments 5 years to regulate a domain that evolves every 6 months,
then even the smartest regulations are doomed from the start. This creates a formal risk equation for policymakers. Risk equals threat velocity minus governance velocity.
and if governance can't close that gap, if our speed is consistently slower than the threat speed,
The whole system becomes fragile, no matter how safe any one component seems.
that equation just brings the pacing paradox into stark reality. And we've seen this play out so vividly in real time with the European Union's AI Act.
It's the perfect case study of what happens when governance velocity fails.
Tell us about that.
Well, when the EU began the process, they were aiming for a rigid, rules-based framework, defining high-risk categories to lock everything down. It was the traditional slow-moving approach.
They were trying to define the shoreline.
Exactly. They were trying to define the shoreline years in advance. But as the process dragged on for years, frontier models, the big generative AIs, they just accelerated dramatically.
Introducing risks they hadn't even thought of.
Risks they couldn't have conceived of when they started drafting. So the law was solidifying even as the ground beneath the entire industry was shifting.
So they were trapped by their own slow process. They couldn't adjust fast enough.
They were in an impossible bind. The ground literally shifted beneath their feet. And the result was this necessary, real-time pivot to a much more agile system, what they called the Digital Simplification Package.
So what did that do?
It meant delaying certain high-risk rules and, critically, empowering a central body, the AI office, to dynamically update thresholds, to rely on more agile, principles-based oversight.
In other words, they discovered the hard way that they had to build adaptive governance into the framework.
Because their initial rigid approach was already failing. It's an object lesson in why speed matters more than precision.
So if we connect all this to the bigger picture, where does the real problem lie?
The source material offers a pretty profound conclusion on that. The true fragility isn't in the code. The code is complex, sure, but it's solvable. The real fragility is in us.
In our institutions.
Our slow, fragmented institutions, our brittle public trust, our short attention spans, and the incredibly slow pace of our moral deliberation.
So the new mandate for governance isn't to stop the system, but to learn to move with it. What are the essential shifts we need to make?
We have to move from rigidity to adaptability in our laws. We have to shift from the impossible task of prediction to guaranteed preparedness.
For a wide range of futures.
And most critically, we have to prioritize emotional and ethical intelligence in our decision-making, not just purely technical intelligence.
Ultimately, the governance of AI isn't about regulating the machines in isolation.
No, not at all. It is about regulating the complex, deeply human space where AI meets society. And because that space is fundamentally human, our focus has to be on negotiating our future with the technology.
Focusing on questions of dignity, agency, and trust.
Exactly, not just on technical performance benchmarks.
So we can't possibly predict every harm. We can't freeze the future into a set of fixed rules. But the final takeaway of this deep dive seems to be this. We can and we must build systems and a society that are resilient enough to navigate whatever comes next.
And that resilience depends entirely on our internal pace. The pace of our technology does not define the future. The pace of our collective wisdom does. That is the essence of anticipatory governance.
Something for you to mull over as you go about your day. What is the current adaptation velocity of your own organization or even your own thinking? Are you covering the zone, or are you still trying to aim for a ball that has already moved? We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.